With Marvel's Spider-Man 2018, Insomniac Games managed to deliver what I believe is the definitive interpretation of the character, in a similar fashion to what Rocksteady achieved with Batman in the Arkham games. They successfully distilled everything that makes Spider-Man appeal as a character down to its core essence, while also tackling a type of Spider-Man story we have never seen in any other interpretation outside of the comics circa 2007. This game managed to give me, as a fan and reader of Spidey, what I had longed to see in a Spider-Man story, something which Marvel had not delivered in a long time for me. A story which has a more mature Spider-Man, tackling adult issues, one that somewhat has his life figured out and is no longer in school. Every other interpretation of Spider-Man in media, such as TV shows, movies, and games, tends to tackle the era where Spider-Man is a high school or college student. A post-college Spider-Man is something new that hadn't really been tackled in media before. When you think of Spider-Man, there's a few key things you think of: power and responsibility, relatable circumstances like relationship issues, money problems, and work-life balance. Then, when you think of the supporting cast, you think of Aunt May, Mary Jane, J. Jonah Jameson, and the Osborns. I think a very key part of a lot of Spider-Man stories is the tug-of-war between Peter Parker and Spider-Man. Every time Spider-Man experiences a win, Peter Parker loses. One of the things I think we love about Spider-Man is the struggles of the circumstances he endures, and how Peter Parker rises above it. You come for the Spider-Man aspects of the story where he fights bad guys, but you stay for the ongoing story of this man's life. I can't even remember when or how I was introduced to Spider-Man. However, I do know that it was definitely before Spider-Man 2 had released. I was either introduced to the webhead through Sam Raimi's Spider-Man or Spider-Man the Animated Series. I have vague memories of me being very little on the verge of falling asleep while the final fight occurs between Spider-Man and the Green Goblin. Nothing gets me more excited than Spider-Man getting the crap beat out of him in that fight, or the first few notes of the opening to Spider-Man the Animated Series, which I also have very faint memories of watching on Fox Kids, and it played before X-Men the Animated Series.
People see me and think they're safer, but it's not really me they're seeing.
Marvel's Spider-Man was first revealed on the 14th of June at E3 2016. I remember exactly where I was when the press conference was going on. I especially remember how excited I was, as this was the E3 where the God of War revival was also revealed.
It was perfect. Perfect. Everything, down to the last minute details.
Both of these announcements almost ended with me being referred and sent out of English class because I was that excited. The reveal trailer in question for Marvel's Spider-Man did not really give us many details about the game itself. All it revealed to us was that Yuri Lowenthal would be voicing Spider-Man, and there was a new original suit that Spider-Man would wear in the game. My initial reaction to Yuri as Spider-Man was just, wait, they got Ben 10 to voice Spider-Man? That's awesome. I remember when I watched this trailer, even though I was excited for the game, I did not like the suit at first. The white spider was off-putting to me, mainly because it's different. If this game was revealed now, I would be more open to it than I once was. The trailer does show off one major thing that did not make it into the final game. There is a sequence in the trailer that sees Spider-Man running through a building on the ground floor that is bustling with people. This seems like something that may have been cut because of technological constraints. As we have seen with Assassin's Creed Unity, the PS4, while it could do a lot, it could only render so much on screen before it breaks the game. While being able to explore interior locations while fighting crime would have been a meaningful addition, I'm glad they ultimately delivered the game they did. Ultimately, the almost 90 seconds of footage that was shown did not reveal all that much about the game. We had not yet learned where this Peter Parker was in life, or even if it was Peter Parker. Marvel's Spider-Man would go silent for a number of months. There would be a real drought of news after E3 2016, with very few details being made available about the game. That was until the drought finally ended when Sony would have their next big blowout at E3 2017. I remember during E3 2017 I was at home deep into Injustice 2 as I had had a week of free time because I had finished my exams early. As a result, I remember that as rare as it was, this was the first E3 conference I got to watch live. instead of just monitoring the announcements at school as they would occur. I remember being astonished at the demo that was brought to E3 2017. This is when we learned an absurd amount of information about the game. First and foremost, we got to see a vertical slice of the game running, showing off key features like stealth, combat, and most importantly, web swinging. This was the Spider-Man game people had dreamed of in the aftermath of Spider-Man being sentenced into slavery under Activision. While some amazing Spider-Man games were made under Activision, including Spider-Man 2, which is considered one of the greatest superhero games ever made, under Activision they didn't give Spider-Man the love and care he deserved, for towards the end of their run, he was sentenced to cheap asset flips and movie tie-in games. This was the Spider-Man game I had always dreamed of. A high-quality, open-world Spider-Man game that was a unique take on the webhead.
You know, we wanted to respect the traditions of the franchise, to be loyal to the DNA of the character. We also wanted to mix things up. It kind of represents our whole philosophy about the game.
To top it off, Insomniac were willing to deviate and try new things with the wall-crawling arachnid, by utilising a villain like Mr. Negative, who up to this point had not really received an adaptation. Even cooler, this vertical slice was actually in the final game. Although it was slightly altered for the final release, it was in the game. This demo didn't end with a whimper, it ended with a bang, when they revealed that Miles Morales would be a part of this game. This was before Miles Morales was a household name, when there were whispers of this animated Spider-Man project starring Miles Morales, but nothing concrete had been revealed yet. You can even tell that they were tinkering with various elements of the game up until the very end. The UI that is shown off in this slice is very different to what would be in the final game, with the main changes involving the layout of the UI. The map is moved to the right side of the screen and is slightly increased in size, with the blue border around it being removed. In addition to this, the size of any characters Spider-Man is talking to is decreased, with it now showing a picture and some audio waves beside their name. When Insomniac decided to take on Spider-Man, there was a few things they had in mind.
So I think one thing is we wanted to, create, first of all, we want to create our own Spider-Man universe. We didn't want to tie it to a particular movie or a particular comic series. John and I talked a lot about, and the rest of Insomniac talked about, let's do our own thing, and Marvel totally embraced that. And it started with, let's make him a little bit older. Let's put him, 23 years old, just graduated college, and really at the height of his, mastery of his powers.
One of the big things they emphasized was that this was an older, more experienced Spider-Man who understood how his powers worked and was 23 years old. Insomniac believed that the best Spider-Man stories occur when the two parts of Peter's lives begin to intersect. They didn't aim to tell a superhero story, they wanted to tell a human story, which I do believe they ultimately succeeded in.
If you're going to create an iconic Spider-Man suit, you have to first understand why it's the best superhero suit, period.
You can see how much thought Insomniac put into this world through the design of the game's original costume, the advanced suit. They designed the suit based upon what a 20-something would be inspired by when creating a Spider-Man suit, with the major inspirations being active and compression wear. This extended all the way down to the boots of Spider-Man. They were absent from the advanced suit, with a very solid reasoning. A boot would not be very comfortable when operating as Spider-Man and swinging through the city, so as a result, the boot is replaced with something more inspired by sneakers. They even thought out the advanced suit down to the materials that it was made of.
The red is actually a reinforced and thicker material.
The blue is for breathability and flexibility. Then you have this amazing icon right on your chest.
The white spider is made out of a flexible carbon fiber material.
So you know that it's on the chest. It's also on his gauntlets and also on his feet.
So when he's striking or when he's blocking, it gives him the extra protection.
Insomniac looked at every Spider-Man suit before designing the advanced suit. They noticed that on a lot of the suits they looked at, Spider-Man sported a black spider. In a pure move of genius, they decided, let's make the spider white. This will make him our Spider-Man. Now Insomniac Spider-Man is one of the most well-known and distinct iterations of Spider-Man.
Most of the Spider-Man suits, the spider has always been black. And Insomniac said, what if we make it white?
When we were deciding the colors of the suit, we knew it was going to be red and blue, but it's really important for the player to be able to see his or her character when they're swinging the game. And the nice thing about the white is it adds a really nice contrast. It makes them really pop, especially in shadows.
Paris Games Week 2017 would see another trailer drop for Marvel's Spider-Man. This trailer has a heavy focus around a storyline that never made it into the final game. This storyline saw Peter Parker contemplate if he could take a step back from being Spider-Man. Now that his greatest adversary for the first 8 years of his career, Wilson Fisk, has been sent to prison. I have no idea why this was cut. There hasn't really been many details about this storyline, but I do hope we find out more about it one day. Finally, at E3 2018, Insomniac would bring Spider-Man for one final showing before its release in September of that year. This one would be the big blowout and the part of the game I would anticipate getting to play the most. I remember yet again I was in English when this demo was being shown. My mouth was on the floor at what I had seen. I could not believe how well Insomniac had handled each of Spider-Man's villains, like the Vulture, Electro, Rhino, and the Scorpion. I was astonished that they were going to do the Sinister Six, but it also meant that Insomniac were living up to this being a more experienced Spider-Man who had experience dealing with supervillains. While it was a very exciting sequence to show off, I found myself wondering, did they just show too much of the game? What surprises could possibly be awaiting the player in the end product if they were willing to show us that? Before Marvel's Spider-Man had released, the most controversy the game had found itself in was fans hating the White Spider and repeatedly asking the question,
does it come in black?
A few weeks before the launch of the game, when people were starting to get their hands on the final product, a few people began asking the real questions. They weren't asking, is the story good, or did Insomniac do a good job? Instead, they were asking, why is my puddle smaller? And why aren't the reflections as abundant? The puddle you showed me in the gameplay from E3 2017 doesn't match what I can see here in the final game. Insomniac promptly responded to the concerns, simply stating, it's just a change in the puddle size. There's no downgrade at all. Insomniac would ultimately get the last laugh on Puddlegate, when they would eventually release the New Game Plus update, where they would add stickers for photo mode. Among those stickers were puddles. I was eagerly anticipating the release of this game, to the point where this was one of the first games I pre-ordered after I had began the process of going digital with all my PlayStation games. I remembered I pre-ordered the Digital Deluxe Edition because I wanted to get access to all of the game's additional post-launch content. This was the first and one of the only games where I stayed up till midnight to play the game the first moment that I could. I played it for around 6 hours or so before I had a quick nap and got ready for school. Before I had left for school, I had just finished the sequence where Spider-Man teams up with Jefferson Davis. That entire day was torture for me because I was exhausted and all I could think of was how much I wanted to be playing Spider-Man. Luckily, I had a free period that day, so I only had to slug my way through 2 classes. By the time it hit 10 AM Saturday morning, I had completed the story and was absolutely impressed by what I had just played. The key moments hit the necessary emotional beats. Then began the cleanup. By the Sunday around 12 PM, I had the Platinum Trophy. I think it was in my first 10 or 15 Platinum Trophies. But in my obsession with getting that Platinum Trophy, I had forgotten one very important detail. I had a test on Monday, which I had not studied for, of course. I do not quite remember the outcome of that, but it was for economics and I think I passed. In Marvel's Spider-Man, we find Peter Parker in a very interesting place. He's a fully realized Spider-Man who has spent the last 8 years actively participating as New York City's one and only Spider-Man. The player is essentially brought into the world of a fully realized Spider-Man where he has had 8 years of adventures, and fought many of his iconic foes like the Rhino, Lizard, Electro, and Sandman. I especially love how the player is dropped into the ending of an era for Spider-Man at the beginning of the game. The player, just like Peter Parker, is in a rush to get into the action. We watch as this character is torn between his life as Peter Parker and his responsibilities as Spider-Man. This is truly on display within the first 2 minutes of the game when Peter Parker has to make the difficult choice of paying his rent to avoid eviction or rushing into action as Spider-Man to take down the Kingpin. This is a decision which has consequences for Peter later on when he goes to his apartment and has been evicted. Insomniac don't need to tell the player that this will be the biggest win in this Spider-Man's career so far. There's nothing more emblematic of this opening section being the end of an era than Spider-Man donning the classic red and blue costume. The assault on Fisk Tower is a great but short set piece. The player feels a real sense of danger during this section. There is a lot of twists and turns. Forces on both sides engaging in gunfire and innocents caught in the middle who must be saved by Spider-Man. The Kingpin is introduced to us as a cunning adversary to Spider-Man. All this fighting and destruction is occurring on his property, and he is just sitting at his desk like nothing is happening. He is not worried. He's been on top for many years before this encounter, and it will be the same after. The Kingpin is not fazed at all by this interaction, showing that he truly believes that he is the one in control, to the extent that he had prepared for Spider-Man to show up in his office, since he had 2 sets of machine guns installed to fire at him. It's as this interaction continues that we watch the Kingpin's calm composure slowly turn to anger and frustration as he begins to lose control of the situation at hand. The Kingpin is a fine introductory boss fight that is very basic and does a good job of utilizing the mechanics the player has learned up to this point. The fight revolves around stunning the Kingpin through either throwing nearby objects at him or webbing him up with gadgets, allowing the player to then wail on the Kingpin with a flurry of attacks and damage him. The opening of the game is emblematic of Insomniac's interpretation of Spider-Man. It is the final chapter of a story that the player is not privy to. It is the moment where he begins the transition from the classic Spider-Man to Insomniac Spider-Man. When talking about an adaptation of a property, in my opinion, there are a few things to keep in mind. An adaptation will change things. This doesn't bother me. At the end of the day, the original will always be there to revisit, and an adaptation does not erase that. I don't think it's fair to criticize an adaptation for changing an element. There needs to be a bit more depth to the critique than that. At the end of the day, I think it's important to recognize the context around which the change was made. The big question to ask is, does the change serve the story or function of the adaptation in a way that makes for a good story? I think this game does a good job of providing something very familiar to everyone, while also doing a lot of new things that we haven't seen before. It does an amazing job of incorporating both new and old elements of Spider-Man. It's not beholden to the source material. It's willing to deviate where it makes sense for the story, providing something truly unique. For instance, the introduction of Miles Morales into the story is a great idea, one that had not been properly utilized in Spider-Man stories. This game does an amazing job of intertwining the origin of Miles into the narrative in a way that makes sense and does not feel shoehorned in. This also gives the universe of the game the opportunity to play with Miles in a way the comics never really did. It allows Peter to have an active role in the origin of Miles, showing the two interact and building the relationship to the point where it makes sense for him to take him under his wing. We see that Miles looks up to Peter in both his civilian life and superhero life as Spider-Man. We watch as the actions of Peter Parker inspire Miles Morales and shape him. A small moment between the two that is the epitome of this is when Spider-Man teaches Miles Morales how to fight. It occurs right after the loss of his father, and you can see it's an interaction that means a lot to Miles. It also gets paid off later in the game. The loss of Jefferson is the beginning of Miles' journey to become Spider-Man. It gives him a motivation to be spurred on by. It's also a case of Insomniac playing with the conventions of the source material, as normally it is Rio who dies, and based off what plays out in future games, I really like this change. Martin Lee serves as this game's main antagonist for its first 2 acts. He is a newer addition to the Spider-Man mythos, coming out of Brand New Day in the wake of One More Day, where Marvel essentially intended to soft reboot Spider-Man, reintroduce some characters that were long gone and create some new stuff. One of the aspects of the character that is not touched on as much in the Insomniac interpretation is that he is a character with split personalities. Martin Lee, while aware of his actions as Mr. Negative, does not necessarily want to commit those actions. He is essentially a hostage in his own body. They lightly touch on this in one of the audio recordings you can find in Otto's base, where it's elaborated that Otto had been developing medication for Martin Lee to help with his outbursts. But for the most part, the vibe I get from Martin Lee and Mr. Negative is that he was waiting to wage his war on Norman Osborn, putting it off as long as he could hold off his inner demon. And when Fisk was arrested, he gave in. He created Feast as a force for good to balance out the evil he would eventually unleash upon New York as Mr. Negative. I wish Insomniac delved more into what makes Martin Lee tick. In fact, I hope they delve more into him and how Mr. Negative actually works. The player is introduced to Martin Lee before Mr. Negative, allowing them to form an opinion about the type of man he is. Martin Lee is a good man. who benefits society by helping the homeless. We slowly watch as this image is torn asunder throughout the game's story. We get his origin in reverse. He is performing all these terrible acts with no idea as to why, only for it to be revealed later in the game that he is doing it out of revenge for the death of his parents, caused at the hand of Norman Osborn, who he thinks is responsible. We also get a glimpse into just how much Martin cares for what he has built and is jeopardizing. This is especially evident in his interactions with May and Peter. Peter begins asking questions about the inner demons. Lee, without giving away that he's Mr. Negative, attempts to dissuade Peter from looking into the matter further, showing that he does care about Peter. Everything in the core plot of this game connects to Norman. Norman helped maintain the power dynamic by ensuring that Fisk was kept in power. Norman experimented on Martin Lee, leading to the death of his parents. This led to Otto being pushed out of Oscorp and Norman sliding him at every turn. All of this done in service of protecting his family, to develop a cure for a disease that would take his family from him. Insomniac's interpretation of Norman is very similar to what you would expect in some ways, and very different in others. This version of Norman is driven to save his family, thus giving a motivation to Norman to establish why he may be making some selfish decisions. I really like the humanization of Norman Osborn. He's typically shown to have a level of disdain towards his family, generally being disappointed in his son Harry. By making his family and the preservation of that family his overall motivation, it sets up a long-term arc for the character, along with laying the foundation for why Norman may eventually become the Green Goblin. Making Norman the mayor in Marvel's Spider-Man was such a great decision. It plays on some of the characteristics we typically associate with Norman. It also allows Insomniac to involve Norman in an antagonistic role towards Spider-Man without ever necessarily needing the character to put on a mask. To accomplish this, he employs Silver Sable and Sable International, who will act as a private security force for both the city and Mayor Osborn. With Mary Jane, Insomniac decided to create a very different interpretation of everyone's favourite red-headed love interest. Mary Jane in the 1960s represented counterculture of that era, where all women were expected to be obedient and serve others. In that setting, Mary Jane defied this expectation, as she was the bombastic woman who listens to rock and roll, taking on the role of the party girl with a defiant nature. In the comics, we are first introduced to Mary Jane in a very assertive fashion. Insomniac decided to reinvent the character for their Spider-Man universe. All people expect of Mary Jane in a Spider-Man story is for her to act as emotional support for Peter. She doesn't get involved in the same plots as Spider-Man very often. Insomniac decided to make her a more active participant in the plot by making Mary Jane a reporter. This gives her a reason to get more involved in the plot. She still acts as emotional support for Peter, but it also allows her to do more than that, and actively contribute in a meaningful way. Plus it brings with it even more comparisons to Superman, by essentially turning Mary Jane into Lois Lane. Think about it. They are both now defiant reporters who will put themselves in danger to chase a story, gaining recognition and accolades in doing so. One of the more memorable Mary Jane moments from this game comes from when she is just hanging out with Peter in her apartment. He's preparing food and then needs to run off, drops his clothes on the floor, and then she calls him out for it. This is the type of thing that makes sense for Peter Parker to get called out on. It's the absurdity and awkwardness of the situation that makes for an entertaining scene on behalf of the player. Both Peter and Mary Jane embody their will they won't they relationship in this story. It was a staple of Spider-Man for a long time, and one thing I am glad they put to bed at the end of this game. Because having Spider-Man and Mary Jane get back together and be in a more committed relationship better embodies a more realized and experienced Spider-Man. He isn't struggling with dating anymore, and can move on to the more complex issues of relationships. To go along with this, the player will throughout the story switch perspectives from Spider-Man to Mary Jane. These sections are some of the most exposition heavy in the game. The Mary Jane portions of the game are stealth sections where she must sneak around enemies in order to gather information that advances the game's plot, or expands the world of Marvel's Spider-Man. The Mary Jane elements can be both some of the most intriguing and boring sections of the game. There is one of the sections that I do enjoy. It's the sequence where Mary Jane infiltrates Norman's penthouse. The reason I enjoy this Mary Jane section the most out of all of them is that she's fully decked out once you reach this part of the game. She can perform stealth takedowns and lure enemies away, making this section the most interesting one to play, because it doesn't just boil down to avoiding enemies and objects in the environment. The Mary Jane parts of Marvel's Spider-Man are intended to act as a change of pace for the player, allowing them to escape the monotony of playing as Spider-Man. However, the gameplay for Spider-Man is so well done in this game that being dragged away from that feels wrong. Why would the player ever want to take a break from something they are enjoying? One of my favourite reinterpretations of a character in the Insomniac games comes from
one of the greatest newspaper editors of our time, J. Jonah Jameson.
Insomniac took what we know about J. Jonah Jameson and dragged him into the modern world in the absolute best way. He still retains his history with the Daily Bugle, having left the Bugle and gone out on his own, now having his own podcast where he shares just the facts. The best part about this is that the player gets to know J. Jonah Jameson on such a personal level without ever physically meeting him. We see J. Jonah critique every little thing that Spider-Man and therefore the player does. He will absolutely guilt you for not doing that crime because you wanted to go straight to the next story mission, or make fun of Spider-Man's sense of fashion when he decides to have a punk makeover. In all the marketing material up to the release of the game, Insomniac had made mention of Peter's mentor, who they were keeping a secret that would not be revealed until the game's launch. The mentor turned out to be Otto Octavius. The moment you first hear his voice and see his name show up on screen, you expect him to turn into Dr. Octopus at some point. Whether it be in this game or a future game, it's an expectation that Insomniac do play around with. Insomniac managed to make the player really care about Otto in a short amount of time. He is as much a main character in the story of Marvel's Spider-Man as Peter Parker is. You get to watch as Otto is beat down by circumstances out of his control, like the grant review. As a result of Peter's activities as Spider-Man, he is late to the prep for the grant review, and Otto has to complete it himself. A selfless action of Peter Parker as Spider-Man has consequences that affect his life outside of the costume. Because he was not there to help with the prep, it results in Mayor Osborn revoking the scientific grant from Octavius Industries. Norman has all the power in this situation and abuses it as expected, crushing his competition and attempting to lure Peter and Otto away to jobs at Oscorp, to ultimately benefit himself, which brews up long fermenting feelings of resentment that Otto has towards Norman. Otto's descent into villainy is slow, which further justifies it to the player. You experience every single step of his corruption into Doc Ock. It happens so slowly that when he finally does take the plunge into villainy, you aren't quite expecting it. He's a man who was driven to villainy not because he wanted to be evil, but because of the circumstances that occurred around him. He was simply a man who wanted to change the world for the better, who wanted to use his great mind to benefit not only himself but those around him. Norman taking his funding away and driving him towards advanced idea mechanics was just the first step in Otto's descent. You can slowly see this philosophy change throughout the course of the game, when he eventually becomes much more concerned with improving on prosthetics, where instead of restoring the lost function, he intends to make something better to replace what was lost. This also subtly says to the audience that Superior Spider-Man will happen eventually, because Otto is entirely motivated to provide mobility to his failing body. Once Otto fully takes the leap into becoming Dr. Octopus, Insomniac deliver some of the game's best scenes and sequences. The sequence at the raft is one of my favourite in the game. What was shown in the E3 2018 gameplay is exactly how the sequence plays out in the final product. What I love about the raft prison break is how fast paced it is, and the build up to the climactic end. The player and Spider-Man are slowly led through the prison and introduced to the various members of the Sinister Six one by one, being led to believe that Spider-Man's greatest foes aren't working together. They are acting individually. That is, until the player reaches the top of the raft where it is revealed that Electro, Vulture, Scorpion, Rhino, Mr. Negative, and Doc Ock are working together. The whole prison break having been orchestrated by Otto, with the members of the Sinister Six being carefully placed to lure Spider-Man to an intended location. It especially becomes apparent by the end of the sequence that the Sinister Six weren't being serious with Spider-Man, they were toying with him. The moment when Otto's betrayal at the raft is revealed is truly heartbreaking. You feel the betrayal that Peter has just experienced. In this journey, you experience one of Spider-Man's greatest victories at the start of the game, only to experience perhaps his greatest defeat at the raft. It becomes hard to believe that the Otto we had met at the beginning of the story was capable of this. It's even more brilliant when you realize that the environment of the Octavius Industries lab changes as the game progresses. You can slowly watch Otto's descent unfold in the background. You can see the upgrades he is formulating for Spider-Man's foes right under Peter's nose. You can see how he takes an interest in the raft under the guise of upgrading the raft's defenses, essentially lying to Peter. That makes Otto's betrayal hurt even more. Otto's plan involves enlisting Spider-Man's greatest foes to attack Osborn and New York on various fronts, like unleashing a plague upon New York City and attempting to poison the city's water, all in exchange for upgraded equipment and personal favors, with the end goal of ruining Mayor Osborn's reputation and enacting revenge. This leads to Otto deploying the members of the Sinister Six to different parts of the city to accomplish these tasks. If there is one missed opportunity in this game, it's that there is no fight with all of the Sinister Six at once. I understand why there isn't though. It would be a lot to process at once for the player and the console. Perhaps the PS4 was not powerful enough to achieve this. As a result, we wound up with the two fights that pair up two members of the Sinister Six, with one revolving around air combat with Electro and Vulture, while the other revolves around ground combat and manipulating objects with Scorpion and Rhino. Personally, of these two, I always dread the Scorpion and Rhino fight. The fight always manages to give me a degree of challenge, because especially on ultimate difficulty, they are too much to handle together. Having to manage the Rhino charging at the player while Scorpion shoots projectiles from far away is a lot. Of the two, I prefer the air combat of the Vulture Electro fight because it's very different to what the player has experienced in boss fights up to this point. Every boss fight before this has seen the player firmly planted on the ground. This one changes the scenery and forces the player to think on their feet. Or I guess, webs in this case. I feel like the fight being airborne adds an extra layer of maneuverability that is not present in the Rhino-Scorpion fight. Otto is at his best at the very end of the game, where the stakes are at its highest, where all the plot points are beginning to converge upon the climactic showdown between Peter and Otto at Oscorp. The point where the life of Peter Parker and Spider-Man truly intersect with Aunt May's life and the fate of New York at stake. There's a few things a boss fight requires in my eyes to be considered great. There's a number of factors to be considered, like story significance and mechanical depth. For me, a lot of the boss fights lack mechanical depth in Marvel's Spider-Man. The game only really has 2 to 3 core mechanics it can rely on for any fight, being throwable objects, webbing enemies, and web swinging. The Doc Ock fight isn't a fight I am eager to face when I replay the game because of its mechanical depth. For me, it's about the story significance. In my eyes, the best of the best boss fights will provide a significant level of challenge to the player, where they must decipher what the fight is trying to teach them. A good boss fight is a culmination of what has been learned in the game or area up to that point, like doing an exam for a subject. What I consider one of the best boss fights in terms of mechanical depth is Roxas from Kingdom Hearts 2, while Doc Ock takes the cake in terms of story significance. For me, a lot of the fights in Marvel's Spider-Man fail in the mechanical aspect as they essentially all utilize the same 3 mechanics. However, where they do succeed is the story significance of the fights. The player understands the stakes that are at hand when engaging in the various boss fights, especially Doc Ock. The Doc Ock fight has 2 phases for the player to engage in. The first phase focuses around the player stunning Doc Ock through the use of throwing items towards him or utilizing gadgets to quickly stun him, allowing the player to get damage in while he recovers. Stage 2 sees the player lose access to their gadgets and instead having to rely solely on their reflexes and fists to overcome their fallen mentor. The very end of this fight has my favourite scene in the entire game, where Otto reveals that he knew Peter was Spider-Man the whole time, which further recontextualizes the actions of Otto up to this point. because he knew that his actions would put him in conflict with his student. He knew Peter was Spider-Man since the beginning of the game when he caught him but didn't disclose this to ease his protege. It's truly heartbreaking watching the exchange between Peter and Otto, where the player really gets to see just how twisted Otto has become by his arms. We realize he is too far gone and is now a shell of his former self. A once great man who wanted to help the world, now resorting to blackmail and preying on his students' responsibility complex, where Otto has become no longer interested in the betterment of humankind, but rather selfishly became interested in his own mobility for a failing body and proving his worth as a human being. Where you watch as Peter has to walk away from a man who he considered to be a mentor and like a father, as he screams out in pain, feeling betrayed, which only adds to the emotional intensity of the scene. You can see just how hard it is for Peter to leave Otto in the Oscorp building. The performance of Yuri Lowenthal as Peter Parker is so good that it makes me forget that I'm hearing Ben 10. All I hear when he is on screen is Peter Parker. Same with William Sulliers as Otto Octavius. When he is on screen, he steals the show. I forget that I am listening to Rigby from Regular Show, and am absorbed by his performance as Otto Octavius. The Insomniac interpretation of Aunt May might be the definitive interpretation. In the few scenes throughout the game that she does have, Insomniac managed to portray the type of person that May is. She's a person who wants to do the right thing and help where she can, which is naturally rubbed off on Peter as she raised him. To top this off, Insomniac give May something to do in the story. She isn't just old and waiting around for Peter to visit and constantly being worried about what he's up to. In this interpretation, Aunt May works at Feast, highlighting all her best qualities, as a loving, caring woman who attempts to make the world a better place, even at the cost of her own health. She keeps giving and giving until she has nothing left to give. In the back half, you watch as May's health slowly deteriorates, until she is bedridden and Peter is faced with the greatest decision of his life: save the woman who raised you or cure New York. It's a scene that embodies the moniker "with great power, there must also come great responsibility." Peter has the power to save Aunt May, but is burdened with the responsibility of curing New York. It's the sense of responsibility that both Peter and the player feel in this moment that causes the death to feel even sadder. In the heart of the player, we know that Peter will do the right thing, and save the anti-serum for the rest of New York. But there is a moment where we do question if he will do the right thing. It's this moment where Yuri's performance is at its peak. It shows how convincing his performance is when you are questioning if Peter Parker will do the right thing. I like to think that May's final conversation with Peter reassures him of the decision he has to make. She's proud of her nephew who has saved so many people but will be unable to save her. I like how Insomniac handled May knowing Peter is Spider-Man. It's not something that's brushed over with few ramifications of that knowledge. Insomniac used May in a way where it just reaffirms that Peter has done the right thing up to this point, and he knows in his heart what the right thing to do now is. Killing Aunt May was a risky decision on Insomniac's part, but it also shows an effort to do things that up to this point had not been done in a more cinematic medium like a game or movie. Aunt May has died before in the comics, but they will always be able to say they did it first in a cinematic medium before the movies. It will also make future stories more interesting, as the support system that Aunt May offered is no longer there. If Peter is struggling with a rent payment, he can't go to Aunt May anymore for money. When the much anticipated PS5 finally launched in November 2020, Spider-Man Miles Morales was released as a launch title. If you bought the Ultimate Edition of the game, you were treated to a remastered version of 2018's Marvel's Spider-Man. You could also pay a small fee to purchase the remaster if you owned the base version of Miles Morales, which retailed for $50. It was upgraded for the PS5, being able to output at 4K 60. It also boasted the introduction of ray tracing. Ray tracing is a feature that is very nice. It's a subtle setting that focuses around reflections and lighting. Being able to see Spidey in the windows of a building as you run up is a nice detail that is added with ray tracing. This version of the game added a range of performance options. The original PS4 version had a performance mode and a quality mode for the PS4 Pro. Now, on the PS5, there is more options in regards to what you can prioritize. The player now has access to a third performance option, Performance RT. Performance RT runs at 1440p and 60 FPS, with the addition that it has ray tracing enabled. For me, this is the way I always play Insomniac's titles. I love having a mode that is 60 FPS, has ray tracing enabled, and manages to look a little better than performance mode. There was one other change that Insomniac made for the remastered version. Peter got a new haircut. Oh yeah, he also completely changed his appearance and has a new face. I loved the old face. I was used to it, I accepted it. It's what I would think of when I think of a more adult Peter Parker. The reason that was cited for changing facial models for Spider-Man was because they wanted to closer match Yuri Lowenthal, to better match the animations captured through motion capture. When announcing the new facial model, Insomniac were quoted as saying, "In order to bring the best performances to players with our next generation Marvel Spider-Man games, we have recast the face of Peter Parker. We loved working with John Bobniak on the original game. However, to get a better match to Peter Parker's Spider-Man actor Yuri Lowenthal's facial capture, we have cast Ben Jordan to be the face model for Peter Parker on the PS5 console. He looks incredible in-game, and Yuri's moving performance takes on a new life. The facial animations with the new face in Miles I have no issue with. I think it looks good there. However, in Spider-Man Remastered, I find myself preferring the original. Peter now looks much younger than he previously did, and in several scenes I find that the original face manages to convey an emotion better than the remastered face. For instance, Peter's conversation with Otto Octavius after he's being defeated. With the original facial model, you can really see the anguish on Peter's face about what has transpired. How hard of a decision this is for Peter to make. To have to come to terms with how far his mentor has fallen and how twisted and broken he has become by the world around him. A detail that is lost with the remastered face that added to the scene were the tears under Peter's eyes. In the original, this added to the anguish that was experienced by Peter Parker. Portrayed how conflicted and broken up he was about his actions and complicity in enabling Doc Ock. With the remastered facial model, I think the big issue with why it doesn't work as well is that it doesn't feel like it was touched up to seamlessly work as intended, which is why the emotion of Yuri Lowenthal's performance does not come through as much. You can still feel the performance in the dialogue as it is the exact same. I kind of wish they held back the remaster for after the launch of the PS5. This would have given Insomniac more time to tinker with the new facial model and really make sure that Yuri's performance shines through. I love the gameplay of Marvel's Spider-Man. It's very much inspired by both the Arkham games and Spider-Man 2. This can be seen in how the combat very much feels rhythm-based, just like the Arkham games. You aren't too incentivized to play around with gadgets in combat or deviate from what you are comfortable with. I find that the more you utilize the tools that are presented to you, the more fun the combat system becomes. I really appreciate the amount of variety in the gadgets. Stringing them together is really satisfying. It makes for interesting ways to take out large groups of enemies in a much quicker and more efficient way. You can pull off a lot of cool stuff by doing more than just mashing the square button. Actions like performing a ground pound or swing kicking enemies. Swing kicking enemies in particular is one of the most satisfying actions to perform in the game. That and yanking weapons from enemies because I love the sound it makes. Spider-Man is able to increase his move pool throughout the game, through the game's skill tree. There are 3 sections to the skill tree: Innovator, Defender, and Web-slinger. Innovator focuses on stealth, gadgets, and utilizing the environment to your advantage. For instance, in the Innovator part of the skill tree, the player can unlock weapon yanking, allowing Spider-Man to disarm nearby enemies and potentially keep his combo going, while the Defender portion of the skill tree focuses more on hand-to-hand combat and defense. For instance, one of my favorite things to obtain from this part of the skill tree is the perfect dodge, because it allows me to generate more focus if I manage to dodge at the perfect time. Then lastly, there is the web-slinger tree, which focuses all around, you guessed it, web-slinging. It's not just web swinging in the traversal sense, but also in the combat sense. As in this part of the skill tree, the player can unlock the swing kick. The swing kick, in my opinion, is one of the best abilities Spider-Man has access to in this game. Why is that, you may ask? Well, it allows Spider-Man to evade enemies, and end combat encounters quickly by simply kicking enemies off a roof. You didn't see it, but he did web them to the side of the building. He didn't just let them fall to their untimely deaths. In addition to this, it adds a sense of momentum to the combat, which adds to the fun. For me, I love to perform combos. I really like seeing the number go up with each attack. It's especially satisfying to pull off a really high combo in the hundreds. It's also equally disappointing when you manage to lose that combo. The combat even has a risk-reward system attached to it. As the player attacks enemies or uses gadgets, a focus bar will fill up in the top left corner. This bar can either be used to regenerate the player's health or perform an enemy takedown. Enemy takedowns are quick to use and are thrilling to watch. However, the enemy type will determine just how many bars the enemy takedown requires. This gets the player into a state of mind where they must decide, is it worth keeping the bar filled in the event I need to heal, or should I use it immediately to take an enemy off the board? In addition to enemy takedowns, there is also suit powers. Every suit that the player purchases in the main game for Marvel's Spider-Man will come with a suit power. These can be as simple as Spider-Man just yells dumb quips at his enemies, Spider-Man using drones to execute his foes, or my favourite, the web blossom, where Spider-Man just shoots webs in a circular motion across the nearby area, hitting every enemy in the vicinity. I like this because it wraps up fights with groups of enemies quickly. Suit powers are intended to be used sparingly as they take a long time to generate for the player. There are many different ones for the player to experiment with, which is a welcome inclusion because it allows the play pattern to change from player to player. Perhaps one of my favourite parts of Spider-Man's combat is stealth. I appreciate how well thought out the stealth in Marvel's Spider-Man is. It reminds me a lot of playing the Spider-Man Noir sections of Shattered Dimensions, just with more depth. I love how much thought went into Spider-Man's gadgets, because they can all be used in both combat and stealth. The fact that the gadgets have utility for both forms of play is some great design. Like the trip mine in stealth can be used to place in an area where you intend to lure an enemy, or where they are guaranteed to walk by. However, in combat, this can be flipped to just throwing at an enemy and attaching it to another nearby enemy. Same with the impact web, except this is a gadget that I find has more utility purely for stealth, because it will instantly knock out most enemies that it is used on. For me, there is just something that feels good about pulling off stealth takedowns as Spider-Man, going from conveniently placed perches around the area and slowly picking off enemies. It makes Spider-Man feel like a threatening predator of the shadows. Part of what I think I love about the stealth takedowns is Spider-Man's movement during them. His movements give off the vibe that as a more experienced Spider-Man, he has refined his technique to become more efficient at stealth takedowns, as he has developed as a hero, causing the stealth takedowns to feel quick and snappy. One thing I dislike about the stealth though is the fact that Spider-Man can only take out one enemy at a time while perched, a situation which could be handled much quicker and more efficiently without this limitation now drags. To aid in all forms of combat, Insomniac included suit mods. Up to 3 suit mods can be equipped from the suits menu. These all aid the player in some way, and there are many different types. From being able to generate more focus from attacks, absorbing a hit without losing a combo, or even just taking less damage from a specific type of projectile, like bullets or rockets. These are a minor part of the game which can often be forgotten about, but are quite helpful when utilized. Now, let's talk about the meat of the game. Web swinging is an aspect of a Spider-Man game that needs to work. If it doesn't feel good to be swinging around as Spider-Man, then the game has failed. Because that's what the player will be doing for a majority of the game, swinging around from location to location. The reason the web swinging is fun in a game like Marvel's Spider-Man is because of the pendulum-based movement. The player always has a sense of where the webs have attached to on a building based upon how the swinging is feeling at any point. Where when the player begins web swinging, it feels faster. But the further Spider-Man swings on that singular web, the slower he moves, like a pendulum as it reaches the top. The sense of momentum that is maintained between each web is something Insomniac managed to successfully pull off. This allows the player to reach faster and faster speeds. as they intermingle different combinations of moves as they traverse the city as Spider-Man. This is something that makes the web swinging enjoyable. Whereas in a game like Marvel's Avengers, Spider-Man does not have the same sense of momentum. Each web swing feels like its own individual movement that has no bearing on the next web from Spider-Man. The lack of momentum leads to the web swinging in that game not feeling as satisfying. Web swinging in Marvel's Avengers also had Spider-Man's webs attached to the sky as opposed to buildings, like in Marvel's Spider-Man. This is another part of why I don't like the web swinging Marvel's Avengers anywhere near as much as in this game. One of the abilities that Spider-Man has in this game that allows him to propel his momentum while in the air is the point launch. Is this an ability that is original to this game? No, the Amazing Spider-Man games have something similar. But what I love about the point launch is that the player is able to use it to build even more momentum while web swinging, also allowing the player to jump over large sections of buildings if timed correctly. Marvel's Spider-Man gives the player the ability to perform tricks while in the air. This allows the player to have some fun as the wall crawler while in the air. When you think of Spider-Man and how he moves around the city, you think of him performing movements like flips in the air. The way that this version of Spider-Man moves adds to his characterization. He isn't struggling with web swinging, and it shows in his movements. It portrays the amount of experience that the character has without needing to tell the player that he's been doing this for a long time. It's awesome how Spider-Man interacts with the environment around him as well. For instance, if Spider-Man is running along a wall and there is a fire escape in the way, he will traverse through it in a fluid motion, allowing the player to maintain the momentum they have built up to this point. Momentum and maintaining that momentum is a big part of every facet of Insomniac's web swinging system. One detail I do appreciate about the web swinging is that when Spider-Man is swinging through the city, and he swings through a tree, you can hear the leaves of the tree rustle. It's small details like this that add to the experience. Part of why the player is willing to engage in all the side content in Marvel's Spider-Man is that the traversal is fun. Because it is fun to traverse New York City, the player will do what they can to continue playing the game and engaging in its content. The side content is slowly introduced to the player throughout the game, slowly introducing activities to the player as to not overwhelm them with the content. I much prefer how Spider-Man slowly introduces activities to the player. A big issue I have with a lot of modern open world games is that it can be overwhelming to be dropped into a world. Check the map and there is 500 icons begging the player's attention. It's a lot like when you open Netflix looking for something to watch. If you don't immediately have something in mind, you are overwhelmed by the amount of content, and spend time scrolling, looking through the options. A part of the game that helps ease this is how the player can see activities that are nearby without needing to open the map. With the click of a button, the player is alerted to the activities in the nearby area that are closest. The greatest example I can think of when it comes to overwhelming the player is Cyberpunk 2077. When you open the map in Cyberpunk 2077, there is hundreds of icons begging the attention of the player. Are all of these necessarily side content that can be engaged with? No. Some of these are vendors and items that the player can buy, but the sheer amount of stuff on the map at once is overwhelming. The first of these activities that the player is introduced to are the surveillance towers. Yuri simply asks Spider-Man to go to each one and get them working. As this is right after the player is first let loose into the open world, we are eager to engage with this content. It gives us an opportunity to play around with the systems of Marvel's Spider-Man like web swinging. The player is encouraged to partake in all the game's side content to unlock suits and further upgrade gadgets. You want to unlock the Spider Armor Mark IV? You better do some gang hideouts, collect some backpacks, and take on Taskmaster's various challenges. One of my favourite of the game's side activities is the backpacks. I really enjoyed collecting these because there is not too many throughout the map. The backpacks also add to the story of Insomniac's Peter Parker, portraying to the player things Peter has attempted, foes he has fought, and allusions to a larger universe. I like how the backpacks portray the adventures of this Peter Parker, from web wings that apparently were not very aerodynamic to eye lenses that almost blind the user, and even the classic web shooters, which portray to me at least that a lot of things in this Spider-Man universe began in their classic iterations before evolving throughout his career, from tech to foes. This goes no further than when they even show off part of the Shocker's original uniform, which also indicates that at one point he used to have a more comic accurate costume. before transitioning to a more armoured appearance. It gives players and fans alike the ability to speculate about how Insomniac would handle characters like Sandman, Mysterio, and the Lizard. One of the more monotonous tasks for me were the Taskmaster challenges. There are 4 types of Taskmaster challenges for the player to engage in. Stealth challenges, where Spider-Man must take out a number of bad guys as quick as possible to achieve a high score. Traversal challenges, where Spider-Man must follow a drone and web swing along the drone's path as close as possible, and horrendously fail at it. Then finally, there is the bomb challenges, where Spider-Man must race to various points across the city to dispose of an explosive device before it is too late. Completing all the game's Taskmaster challenges will see the mimicking mercenary seek Spider-Man out for a confrontation, taking advantage of all he has learned from observing the web-slinger. The fight is very interesting because you can't just default to your normal attack pattern. I really like the attention to detail in how Taskmaster will use technology to mimic various moves from Spider-Man, like how he tries to use his own form of webbing, or when he will use the player's own finishes against them like you have done to so many enemies throughout the game. Defeating Taskmaster will leave the player feeling a bit confused, as Taskmaster was apparently just the tip of the iceberg, as he has been hired by another party to test Spider-Man. Perhaps this is a tease for a future game. We don't quite know who hired Taskmaster just yet. In Marvel's Spider-Man, Harry Osborn is in Europe, also known as Norman's basement. In his absence, Harry has entrusted Peter with taking care of various Oscorp research stations that have been placed around the city. These are all nice, fun and quick challenges to complete. They can range from Spider-Man vandalizing New York City and Spider-Man breathing in dangerous chemicals. The last of the game's side activities involve Black Cat. After allegedly retiring, Peter Parker's old fling has returned to her old ways, burglarizing various buildings across New York. The player can find the various places she has robbed, and must figure out where she has entered from, which is indicated by a cat figure. Upon collecting all of these, the player can now find Black Cat's lair, where it becomes apparent that this was all a setup. Peter Parker and the NYPD have been played. This entire set of collectibles were intended to be put together so Black Cat could break into the NYPD and get all of her gear back, thus setting up the first part of Spider-Man's DLC, The Heist. Marvel's Spider-Man also features side missions which will periodically unlock throughout the story. These can range from taking down everyone's favourite social media influencer, Screwball, foiling Grand Theft Auto heists, yeah, we see what you did there, Insomniac, with your cheeky Grand Theft Auto 4 reference. And finally, what I think is the most substantive of the side missions, the Tombstone thread of missions. It's a series of free missions that sees the player take on Tombstone's gang as he seeks to empower them with similar abilities to himself. This leads to Spider-Man concocting a way to rob Tombstone of his abilities. It wouldn't be very interesting if he just lost them forever, so more than likely only temporarily. But Tombstone is probably the worst boss in all of Marvel's Spider-Man, hands down. He is essentially one of the heavy enemies where you stun him and then repeatedly beat the crap out of him. The side missions outside of the Tombstone Speedball ones are not really much to talk about. Marvel's Spider-Man has a really good selection of alternative costumes for the player to utilize in their adventures throughout the concrete jungle. These suits are unlocked by completing the game's various side activities. Each side activity earns the player tokens, which can be used to upgrade gadgets and unlock alternative costumes. These suits are not all available from the beginning, because the game has a leveling system. As the player gains levels, they will be drip-fed the ability to unlock new suits. This game is guaranteed to have a suit that everyone likes. There are so many available from so many different versions and iterations of Spider-Man, even a few original suits. It's got almost every suit that a person could have asked to be included in a Spider-Man game. Like the Raimi suit, which had its own outrage campaign when it wasn't released as a part of the DLCs. Almost all of the MCU suits are present in the game as well. Most of these were added through updates post-launch. I personally really like using the Stark suit because the suit looks amazing, from its colours to its eyes. Then there's the more comic-inspired suits like the Spider Armor Mark II and the Big Time Stealth suit, which are really distinct and recognisable in their designs. There's also some of the game's original costumes like the Anti-Ock and Velocity suits. The Velocity suit was designed for this game by Artie Granov. He does a lot of the concept art for the MCU movies, most notably coming up with the look for Iron Man for the MCU. It's an original suit designed solely for Marvel's Spider-Man. With this suit, I really like the look of the material that is used for its creation. It looks sleek like armor. The anti-Ock suit embodies many of the things that people, including myself, love about Spider-Man. When Peter Parker is backed into a corner, all the odds stacked against him, he doesn't give up in the face of these odds. Instead, he uses his wits to come up with a solution to his problem. That's what the anti-Ock suit is. It's Peter Parker solving a problem placed in front of him to endure and survive. It isn't simply given to him. He designs and does all the work himself, putting his wit on full display. I love the armored metallic look of this suit. The darker colors make the yellow really pop. Marvel's Spider-Man is the ultimate love letter to any Spider-Man fan. It pays deep respect to the character's roots while also trying new things and providing a new interpretation of the character that can be enjoyed by anyone, whether it be someone who is new to the webhead or a long-time fan who's been following since 1962. Insomniac did such a great job with this game that I can't wait to see what they do with the sequel. And yes, I will cover the DLC, it will just be in a separate video, which I have already written. Insomniac ultimately deliver the definitive Spider-Man experience, one that encapsulates the core essence of the character and what he is about, making the player truly feel like Spider-Man.